So I'm trying to say nice things about it. Randy has been in the journalism business for many years. I won't tell you because then you have a sense of how old I am. He started out as a newspaper journalist and switched over, like many people, to the internet for many years. And now in retirement, semi-retirement, he's gone back to his first love and vocation, journalism, for small newspapers in rural Virginia. And I give you Randy Rieland.
Well, that was inspiration. First, I want to thank Orly for the invitation and having the opportunity to talk to you. It's really a great pleasure to, well, it's certainly not a pleasure to talk about this subject, but to share some of the things I've learned about it. I also want to thank both Orly and Bob for their generous hospitality the past week. We had a great time here in beautiful Vermont. And then, of course, I have to thank my wife Carol, first for that introduction, and also the fact that she and Orly were high school classmates 48 years ago. I'm sorry, that's 4.8. And that's a big reason why we're here.
And we haven't seen each other since
Right,
graduation.
47 years.
Yeah, 47 years ago, last saw each other. So,
And it's been like yesterday.
Absolutely.
so how I got involved with this, just a little background. As Carol said, I got back into journalism, print journalism, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, written for Smithsonian, some other publications, and then this nonprofit in rural Virginia was started. And their idea was they saw a lot of rural newspapers failing, or the newspapers had 1 or 2 people writing for them. And as a result of that, it was very hard to do what we call explanatory journalism, where you deal with complex subjects comprehensively. You know, they were busy covering every board meeting, and they had no time for this. So the idea of this nonprofit was to hire professional journalists to do explanatory / investigative reporting. And so I've done some of that for the past few years for one of the papers, and then this past spring, a paper in a neighboring county, or a nonprofit in a neighboring county who works for a paper, they asked me if I'd be interested in doing a larger piece on the opioid crisis. So I'm writing for 4 or 5 newspapers in that area, in that region. It's called the Piedmont region of Virginia. It's kind of due west of Washington, D.C., about an hour and a half west of D.C. And so I knew very little about the opioid crisis. I had the same stereotypes as probably everyone who doesn't know much about it. And I've been working on this for probably 4 months now, done maybe 70 interviews now. I've learned quite a bit, have learned a lot of things that I couldn't have imagined. And one of the first interviews I did was with this guy named Steve Williams, who's the mayor of a town in West Virginia called Huntington, West Virginia. And you probably have heard about him, or that town, because it's often been described as the ground zero of the opioid crisis. I mean, it's been had a terrible impact there. So one of the things he said to me was, you know, people don't understand that if not 1 more opioid painkiller is sold, or 1 more gram of heroin is sold, the impact of this opioid crisis is going to last for 30 years, 30 to 50 years. I mean, people don't appreciate how long, the impact it's had and the effects that will be sustained over a long period of time. He also described it as what he thinks is the greatest existential crisis facing the United States going forward. You know, there's a lot of flurry in the news media and politics about, yeah, we're going to address this, let's throw money at it, but there's not as much focus on dealing with ripple effects. So what I wanted to do was talk about some of those ripple effects. That's what I'm writing about. So it goes beyond what you often see in a newspaper where there's a story about someone who overdosed and died, which is tragic and a very important part of the story. But what's not often covered is, well, what are the other impacts? Who else is being affected by this? And it affects the whole community, as all of you know, in very profound ways. Just a couple that well, more than a couple that I covered, but one for starters, is shattered families. Families have to deal with this, and it has a lasting impact. I know out in this part of Virginia, it's one of the things that caught my attention right away is that a lot of the people who were overdosing were children of community leaders. There's a mayor, a police chief, a chaplain, people who in times past you would have said, their kids can't be doing serious drugs, you know, they can't be doing dangerous drugs. And it's so, as one woman told me, it hit their community like a wrecking ball. And so there's that effect on families, there's the effect on kids growing up in stressful homes because of the addiction issues. There's increased demands on first responders and on law enforcement. There's increased costs there. There's rising emergency care costs. There's overcrowding of jails and more overall strain on the criminal justice system. There are additional demands on costs for child protective services and foster care, which kind of often is lost in all this. And I can tell you, in Rapahanock County, which is where we live in DC, but we also have a small place out in Rapahanock County. In that county last year, they had one foster family left that they could refer kids to. As a result of that, they ended up sending almost all their foster care cases outside the county. Kids were being sent hundreds of miles away from where they grew up. And often in urban areas. You know, these are rural kids and they're put in urban schools, and it's just like a that's another stressful aspect of it. So that's something they're trying to address, but it's pretty common. The demands on people working in those agencies has really increased. I spoke to a woman who worked in for one of the counties, and she said, you know, in the past we used to spend a lot of our time on truancy cases and maybe making sure the kids had good nutrition. And she said, now we're dealing with abuse cases. We're dealing with child abuse, we're dealing with sex abuse, we're dealing with things that are much more complicated and much more difficult to address. And so that it raises the demands on people in those organizations, in those agencies. Another thing that I hadn't really thought about, but there tends to be more employee absenteeism, more worker compensation claims, more lower productivity in businesses where people who are working with, you know, if they have a drug addiction problem, they're generally not going to be as productive as employees. There are rising HIV and hepatitis rates. We certainly have seen that in Virginia because of people sharing needles. And I know this is the case everywhere, there are many more grandparents raising grandchildren. You know, someone said to me, well, we even have great-grandparents raising their great-grandchildren. And she said, you know, think about that. You're a great-grandparent, you're in your 70s, 80s, you're on Social Security, you're trying to get by, you're worried about your health, and then you have to worry about, well, what happens to these kids? Because I'm not going to live a whole lot longer. So it's that much more stressful. There are also, there's a great need for transitional housing, and I'll get into that some more later. One thing that's come up over and over again is the absence of what people refer to as warm handoff. You know, someone gets out of jail, and there's this weird expectation, okay, go, you're ready to go, you're ready to get back and plug right into society, and it's ridiculous. A point that was made to me by a woman who was in jail for 6 years for drug crimes, and her daughter actually OD'd and died while she was in prison. She said, you know, you have to understand that when you get out of there, you've lost your license, you've lost your job, your family has probably thrown you out, you have no place to live, you may not have a cell phone, and people expect you just to plug in. You know, it's completely unrealistic. But that's the sort of thing that I think communities are only starting to become aware of. There's also elevated levels of neonatal abstinence syndrome, which is something I've written about in the first part of this, and that's when babies are born with an addiction, when they have to go through withdrawal because their mother was pregnant, or I'm sorry, she was addicted when she was pregnant. And so, you know, I spoke to this one woman who was, she had been using during her pregnancy. Her daughter had to go through withdrawal for a month. And you know, one of the ripple effects of that is babies who, they have to stay in the hospital much longer, you know, oftentimes 3 weeks to a month. The cost has been estimated as 3 to 4 times higher than it would be for a normal birth or a conventional birth. And that's just one of those costs that builds up over time. When you look at the cost nationwide, I saw figures like $2 billion in a decade across the U.S., the additional cost of treating NAS babies. And then there's one of the other things that, you know, people don't really think about is the pendulum has kind of swung the other way. So it's very difficult for people with chronic pain to get prescriptions for their chronic pain. And so they're now suffering. You know, that's something that I've seen any number of cases like that where people are like, what am I supposed to do now? You know, I can't get something that I need. I have to live with pain. I'm no longer a productive member of society because I can't go out and work. I have this pain, and you know, I don't have a way of addressing it. And you know, there's also been an increase in addiction-related suicides, which again kind of gets lost in the discussion. I'll talk a little bit about him later, but there's a police chief in this little town called Culpepper, Virginia, and his son committed suicide. And you're thinking, wow, police chief. There's another guy who's head of a drug, I won't get the name right, but it's a drug task force, and he's been head of it for a long time. His son died of an overdose. You know, it's like if anyone, you know, it shouldn't happen to, who's familiar with all this. You know, it happened there too. So, you know, the one thing when I talked to Mayor Williams, he said his first inclination when he saw what was happening in his community was to arrest his way out of it. You know, which is always the first stop, because the connection has always been that this is a law enforcement issue as opposed to a health issue. And I think he found, and they went out and they arrested everyone they could. He said we arrested like 150 people in 2 months. It didn't make any difference. And so he went to his health department and he said, okay, I need to change the way I'm thinking about this. What are the greatest needs in terms of public health needs? And the first thing they said was needle exchange programs. He said, are you crazy? This is West Virginia. He said, no one's going to go for a needle exchange program here. And it was a really hard sell, but they were able to do it. And that gets into the whole area of what's called harm reduction, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. But that ranges from needle exchange to fentanyl strips, where you can check if you have drugs, you can see if there's fentanyl in those drugs. Also, the use of Narcan, which is a really interesting part of this story. If you talk to people about Narcan, and Narcan is what, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but it's the brand name for the drug that's used to revive someone who's overdosing, and it's very effective. The thing that's happened, you won't find anyone who's going to say we should get rid of Narcan, because it's saving lives, you know, and people will say, if my child just had another chance, you know, if they had another chance, I want them to be saved. I want that to happen. And so people are very supportive of that. But as with everything, there have been unforeseen changes in consequences with Narcan, and those being that what you'll see, and certainly in Virginia, you'll see the number of people, the fatalities from overdoses dropping. And people from at a very superficial level will say, hey, we turned the corner. You know, it looks like this isn't such a problem anymore. Well, when I talk to people in law enforcement, what they say is, no, that's a Narcan. You know, we're saving people. People are not using less. Just fewer of them are dying. And the other thing that I'm hearing is that there's a change in behavior of users as a result of Narcan. That in the past, and I'm really oversimplifying this, but in the past you might have found people more likely to overdose in their bedroom or a bathroom somewhere. Now, at least in this part of Virginia, more people are using in very public areas, like at a 7-Eleven parking lot, because they know there are people around with Narcan. It used to be, until recently, only first responders could carry Narcan in Virginia. Now every police officer has Narcan. Plus, you can get it in drugstores. And there are places where it's so readily accessible that the feeling is, if I overdose, someone around is going to be able to save me. And it actually has gotten to the point, a couple other, this is anecdotal stuff, so I can't absolutely say it happened. But one woman told me that she's heard that some people are injecting at stoplights because they know if they overdose, there are people behind them in the car, and they can deal with it right away. And then some police officers and some other people have told me there are cases where dealers are bringing Narcan with them when they deliver. And people inject, and if there's a problem, the dealer has a Narcan because that dealer doesn't want to lose customers. So there's like this, that's kind of one of the ripple effects of Narcan. I mean, who would have thought of those sort of things a couple years ago? The whole push was everyone should have Narcan. And no one's saying that should change, but people have to be aware of, well, okay, the market adapts, and they're some of the sort of things that are happening. One of the other things that people seem to feel, experts seem to feel, is effective is medication-assisted treatment, which some is math, but essentially it's the use of Suboxone, or in times past, more likely would have been methadone. It's essentially allowing someone to function while taking medication, and that over time, ideally, that dosage is decreased and the person no longer needs to use it. Now that can vary widely from person to person. The one problem with that, or the challenge with that, is first you get pushback from a lot of people who say, you know what, we're coddling these people, we're giving them drugs so they don't use drugs. How much sense does that make? And so there's a whole moral evaluation that people are making, a moral judgment, as opposed to we need to deal with this as a health and a medical issue. In some places, I was just talking to a woman this morning who has a program at a jail in Prince William County, Virginia. And they have a program called the DORM program inside the jail, where drug offenders have to apply for that, but they all live together in this one place, and they constantly have therapy. And she said, I think on the horizon, I'm hoping, this is her words, I'm hoping that we could do medication-assisted treatment in the jail, which is a real hard sell in jails, because there's a fear that if you're giving people Suboxone, they're going to give it to other inmates, and it's a really difficult hurdle to clear. But the assumption is what experts have told me, that medication-assisted treatment can be very effective, but only if it's combined with therapy. If you do one without the other, it's a much bigger long shot that you're going to be able to move on. Some of the other things I learned, I always, I knew that it was hard for people to go through recovery, but I wasn't really aware of how frequently relapses occur. And that's just accepted. I mean, the notion, there's always this notion, you do 30 days in a treatment center and you're fine, which is crazy. I mean, I've learned how crazy that is. The assumption is that people are going to relapse numerous times, and that's why you need these support systems to help them recover. And the other part, it's called, the reference is a warm handoff. The idea is someone's coming out of jail, they've gotten therapy in jail, and then it's like, okay, it's 12:01, you're free now, you're on your own. Well, if they don't get to a therapist, if they don't have a place to live, too often they'll go back and live with a family where there might already be a drug addiction problem, or they'll start hanging out with friends who they used to use with. I mean, it's really, really hard. You're like restarting your life with nothing. And people have told me, and again, this is what people have told me, is that when you're an addict and you're using regularly, the basic things that we take for granted, the basic things of your day-to-day life, getting up, doing this, taking care of your car, you know, the sort of things that are just like we are kind of cavalier about. If you're using, you're not thinking about that stuff at all. You know, you're thinking about, I don't want to be sick. I don't want to be sick. I need to use. And so all the sort of day-to-day routine things that we take for granted are not part of what a lot of addicts will do when they're in that life. And so the expectation that they can just go back and pick up their lives is not realistic. They need more help than most people would need. And there again, you get into this whole thing, okay, we're coddling addicts. Why can't they get their act together? Why can't they do this? But that is, you know, the idea of providing that warm handoff where there is housing. There's, well, probably most of you are familiar with Oxford houses, which are essentially places where everyone living there is a former addict, and they live together. There's not like a person in charge, but it's a place where they live together and they support one another, and those have been pretty effective. But there's always a risk. You know, I talked to someone whose daughter was in an Oxford house because she had drinking issues, and she made friends there in the Oxford house. And then when some of these friends who were drug users relapsed when they got out, she was hanging out with them afterwards. And so she got into drugs as a result of that. But that whole residential thing is a big issue, and the jobs, providing jobs and training is critical. And you know, the apprenticeship program that's here, that I was here for lunch yesterday, I was really impressed with. I mean, I think that's exactly the sort of thing that needs to be done, where you're helping people learn skills, learn responsibility, allowing them to feel productive with their lives, and moving forward in a way. And that's the sort of thing, that is a real hard sell in communities, because it's like, yeah, I really feel sorry for them, but you know, this is like a big project to take on. No, I don't want to do it. So that is really one of the very, very big challenges. I think the thing that has really struck me more than anything, though, is I've talked to a number of people who are the parents of children who have overdosed. And it ranges from, well, the one woman I talked to, Amanda, who was, she had been a user when she had her first child, lost that child, lost custody of that child, went back to jail for 6 years. She had committed a number of felonies. You know, she was credit card fraud and bad checks and all those sort of things. Got out of jail, started using cocaine, got pregnant, and then got on Suboxone. So she was pregnant. She thought, okay, well, it wasn't Suboxone. I'm sorry. There's a lesser drug, and I'm blanking on it right now, like Subutex, I think, which is that is often given to women who are pregnant. So she did that, but her child had to go through withdrawal for 4 weeks. You know, she now is, her daughter's 2 years old, and she said, you know, okay, I'm a single mom. I'm an addict. She's in methadone treatment. I'm an addict, and I have 9 felonies. So what am I going to do? You know, who's going to hire me? Where am I going to go with this? And she's, to her credit, she's trying to move forward. You know, she's trying to find jobs, and she's hanging on. And she said, you know, I have to do this for my daughter. But one of the interesting things she said to me was, we were talking about pregnant women who were using. And she said, you know, I'll look at pregnant women and I'll say, how can you do that? How can you be so selfish and do that? And she said, I have to remind myself that I did the same thing, you know. And she said, it's not like I didn't know I was pregnant, but to tell you the truth, I really wasn't focused on that at all. You know, I was focused on, I just didn't want to be sick. And that drove everything. Well, that was my priority over and over again. And so, oh yeah, I have a baby too. And so she is, you know, she's an example of someone who has learned a lot. But she said to me, look, I lost one child, and I lost my life for a long period of time, and I don't know if I'll ever get it back. I mean, she kind of got into this world when she was 19, and now she's close to 30. and she doesn't know if she'll ever get back on the track. There's a woman named Chris who she's now taking care of her 7-year-old granddaughter. Her daughter did, when she was, well, Chris and her husband were on vacation. Her daughter had a baby, had a very young baby, took it to their church and handed it off to a friend of theirs and said, I'm a bad person, and went away, injected, and overdosed. She didn't die, but she overdosed. And so since that time, Chris and her husband took custody of their grandchild. And Chris explained to me, she said, I was so angry at my daughter. You know, I kept on saying, why can't you get your act together? Why can't you do this? You have a child. You're being so selfish. And she said, I had to go to Families Anonymous to kind of to be able to understand what was going on. And she now says, I regret that response. I had to learn that my daughter wasn't doing this by choice. She didn't say, I want to be an addict. I'm choosing to be an addict. She, as Chris said, you know, her brain had been hijacked, that she wasn't able to really deal with it. And you know, they still, her daughter has moved on and had 2 other kids, and there's no contact between Chris and her daughter anymore, or the daughter and her daughter. So it's one of these tragic, you know, family things that have just blown up. There was this guy, Wally Smith, who's chaplain at a hospital there and one of the police departments. And his son had an addiction problem, but he was like poster boy for recovery. He set up a recovery program in the jail. You know, it was, oh man, Brian is just great. He's the guy. He's a model for all of us. If he can do it, my kid can do it. And then, you know what, Brian, he convinced his probation officer that he should get a prescription for Suboxone. He took the Suboxone, traded it for heroin in the streets of DC, took the heroin overdose. And his father, this chaplain, has nothing good to say about Suboxone for I guess, you know, his reasons are, it's, again, you're trading medication or drugs for drugs. But people in the support community were kind of devastated by this, because they all looked to Brian as poster child. Like, this guy, he's setting the model for what we want, and if he can't make it, how are our kids going to make it? So, you know, that's another one of those ripple effects. One death affects all these other families who are so concerned about this. There's a woman, Katrina, who, she was the one who was in jail when her daughter died of an overdose. And Katrina's now in a program with George Mason University, and I forget the term, it's not peer counselor, but it's something equivalent to that. Basically, she starts working with women in the detention center, and she is their guide to the outside world. When they get released, Katrina is like, she's on call, you know? And if there's a problem, she'll go and help them through whatever mess they're in or whatever difficulty they have. She's taken that on as her responsibility, and she said, you know, I lost my daughter. I have to do this. And there's, you know, one story after another like that. There's another quick one I'll just throw in. This guy who was mayor of this town of Warrenton, Virginia. His son died, and it was interesting because when his son died of an overdose, a guy I know who runs a website down there, a news journalism website, he got a call from the police department saying, you know, mayor's son died of an overdose. It would really be great if you didn't report it that way. And so he didn't, and it was kind of kept quiet for a long period of time. The mayor didn't talk about it, and then there was a meeting at which the council was voting on whether or not they were going to allow this residential place in town to continue. And there was a lot of opposition to it, you know, the whole NIMBY thing. I don't want this here, and my community. And at that meeting, the mayor stood up and he said, you know, I haven't talked about this before, but my son died of an overdose. And I think this is why this is important to do this. Well, it turned out the council voted against it anyway. But he felt that since that time, he's been much more outspoken about it. But it took, he told me, he said, I'm sitting at this meeting, I'm thinking, this is crazy. I've lived through this. You know, I have to say something about this. I would be doing such a disservice to my son if I didn't say something about this now. You know, this sheriff, or this police chief, it was Chief Jenkins in Culpepper. You know, he said, and his son committed suicide. He was a drug addict. But he says that he gets calls from mothers in the community to arrest their children because they feel like their kids are going to be safe in jail, that they can't use there. And they also have this mistaken notion that there's going to be this magical treatment in jail and they'll come out and they'll be fine. And he has to tell them that. He has to say, look, jail is not the answer. Let's get your kid into some sort of treatment. That's not the solution. Two more people I just want to mention because, and you know, the one thing he said, and this sounds kind of obvious, but he said, no one gets up in the morning and says, I want to be a heroin addict, you know? I mean, there's this whole notion, and if you go back to the old just say no thing, with just say no, there was always this sense of it's a moral failing if you don't say no. And that became the kind of the model for many, many years, that drug use was a moral failing instead of a health issue. And the one thing, and this may sound kind of jaded, but I think if there's an upside to the opioid crisis, is I think it's been like a teaching experience for America about drugs. I'm hearing more people who 5 years ago would not have said this is a health issue. It was always like a judgment that they'd make. The stigma still exists, but there are more people who understand that you're only going to solve this problem if you address it as a health issue. The last two people I want to mention is a woman, Carolyn, she's a British woman. She and her husband got transferred to Vienna, Virginia, just outside DC, and they spent a really long time doing a search for where they could live. And she said, we're so scientific about this, we look at every statistic, and we came to the conclusion that Warrenton, Virginia would just be the perfect suburb for us. It's a charming place. Well, so they moved there. Their daughter, teenage daughter, had a drinking problem. She's the one who went to the Oxford House and then started using again. It was her grave misfortune that she died during her first overdose. And the mother, Carolyn, well, her marriage broke up shortly thereafter. And she said, you know, I was running around, my daughter told me that the story their daughter told her is she had been drunk at a party and some guy came up to her and just injected in her arm and said, you'll really like this. And she told her parents about that. And they said, well, what do we do? What do we do? You know, now you're using heroin. And they tried to get her in programs, they scrambled around. But, you know, the thing that Carolyn told me is, if I were doing this again now, I would get my daughter on medication-assisted treatment right away. You know, but the inclination is, I want to find some solution out here. So I'm going to make just 3 more calls. And that was one of the lessons she learned. She started something called Families in Drug Abuse photo. And essentially what they tried to do was get people like her who would come together. And initially it was interesting because they got parents of drug overdose victims along with some former addicts. And they'd all come to this meeting, they'd have these conversations, and she said it was great because it was the first time they really got each other's perspectives. And the younger kids who had been using, they got a better sense of what their parents had gone through. Because these people are saying, I was living with anxiety all the time. I was waiting for that call, you know, I was waiting for this to happen. At the same time, these parents had a clear understanding of what their kids had gone through, you know, how difficult it had been for them. So there's been this real growth of support groups in this community, but the harder part, as I was saying before, are, you know, the residential housing and the follow-up, you know, the warm handoff. That's the harder stuff. They're the sort of things that aren't happening as quickly. And finally, the last person is Dee Fleming. Dee was actually getting dressed to go to the funeral of a son of hers when she heard that her son had overdosed.
Wait. She's going to the funeral of a son of hers?
No,
Friend.
I'm sorry, a friend of hers. Friend of her son's. I should make that clear. Thank you. Friend of her son's who had overdosed, and that's when she found out her son overdosed. So, you know, it was, she tells a story about not long after that, she works as a librarian, and someone had heard about this, and his father or his daughter had been killed in an automobile accident, and he wanted to offer, you know, he wanted his condolences to her. So he comes to the library, and they're talking, and you know, it's reasonably pleasant, and then this guy says to her, you know, taking drugs is pretty stupid. I think it's nature's way of weeding out the weak ones. And Dee said, what am I supposed to do with that? You know, I mean, he thinks he's being kind, but he says this horrible, horrible thing. And you know, she said, she was pointing out that when this happens, she said, we're not the ones who get that people bring casseroles to your house. We're not the ones who people send cards to. You know, the stigma is there. No one wants to draw attention to it. No one views it as a tragic death. I mean, everyone knows it's a tragic death, but it's not a public thing. You don't show, there's not public reflections of people's condolences as much. And she said, you know, you suffer alone, you grieve alone, you shelter, you hide. And so what Dee did is she lives in Culpepper, Virginia, and her whole thing is to get every business in the community to have Narcan available, you know? And she knocks on doors everywhere and says, you gotta have Narcan, and she'll go to some, you know, high-end hotels and say, oh, no, we don't need that here, you know, people don't use drugs here, blah, 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 you know, which wasn't the case. But she's taken that as her personal crusade. And again, she'll acknowledge that, you know, when Narcan is used, unless you have a follow-up, you're not getting rid of the problems. You know, people will continue to use, there will continue to be the ripple effects, but her attitude is, if I can save, you know, a handful of people, and they can go on and get their lives back together, then it's worth it. And you know, and the last thing she said to me is, this is how I'm surviving, this is what's keeping me alive. He can't have died for nothing, it needs to mean something. So, you know, that kind of epitomizes what people have said to me and how they feel, and dealing with this personal pain with a public issue that's really complicated. I really I admire what I've heard, I respect what I've heard about what's being done here, but you know, it's one of those things you can't expect it just to be fixed easily. It's a really difficult issue, and you have to hold people's feet to the fire, and you have to make people understand that it's going to take a while. There are always going to be setbacks. That's just the nature of this beast. And I think that's hard for people to comprehend. You know, they like to believe that if we get someone on medication, everything's fine. And you know, the other thing too is that people have said to me, there's no one more manipulative than a drug addict. And people will get burned. People will show their trust to this person. They'll get burned, or they'll get robbed, and you know, and so it's a terrible situation. It's hard to get someone who's been burned to say, oh yeah, I'll do it again. You know, I'll help them again. And that's a really tough call to make. But I think it's incumbent on, the one thing that is going on in this part of Virginia is there's a lot more coordination among the hospitals, among the police departments, among community services. So before, they kind of operated all in their own worlds and they never talked to one another. They're trying to find more programs where there's interaction. And there is that, they're kind of defining a pathway for someone, a recovery pathway. And that's really critical. Everyone has to work together. And there's the whole education part of it. And down there's a lot more, the police are a lot more focused on education, almost more than, well, I won't say more than law enforcement, but you know, they have taken that on as kind of their responsibility. And not do like, this is your, you know, your brain on drugs. You remember that commercial, you know, where they have an egg sizzling in a frying pan as your brain on drugs. You know, not that kind of scare stuff, because kids are like, yeah, right. It's more just making kids aware of this is a health issue. These are the potential consequences. These are the people who it affects. This is how it can affect you. And you know, ironically, when they've gone to the schools to get them to make it part of the curriculum, a lot of times they'll say, well, we have to do all this testing stuff. You know, we don't have time to put in a little class on drugs and those sort of things. So it's really a challenge on many levels, but I would just encourage everyone here who can do so, just keep pushing on it, because it's you know, it's going to be around. It's not, statistics may change, but it's the impact's going to be around for a long time. So I hope this is helpful, and if you have any questions, I'm not an expert, I'm a journalist, so I'll answer any questions you might have. Yeah.
I think it's important to understand how things get to where they're at.
Mm-hmm.
And in my studying this, a source of this whole thing that's going on now goes back to my generation, late 60s, early 70s, in our parenting. And a new thing happened in parenting, free-range parenting, not setting limits, not setting boundaries, let the child express himself. And the word character dropped out of our culture. The Boy Scouts demising is a physical indication of that. So kids were thrown out into our very complicated culture with no boundaries and no structure. Plus the fact the kids were coming from dysfunctional families to begin with. So I think this is a backdrop of how we've gotten to this point.
Yeah, I think there are always, it's a complex issue. And while there are character issues like you talked about, there are also physiological issues. And what some experts would say is the roots of addiction often relate to trauma, childhood trauma. So if there's a traumatic thing that happens to a child, it actually starts to affect your brain. And I think that's the thing that's, you know, you can't say it's one thing by itself or another. But the thing that I've come to realize is there are changes in people's brains that occur. And it takes a long time to fix that. So would it have been better if there were more things like or Boy Scouts, or I'll tell you, out in West Virginia, or the guy in West Virginia, he said that one of the things they did to really raise awareness of the issue in their community was they arranged for every church in the community at 11 o'clock on one Sunday to say, every minister at the same time said, we have an opioid problem. And by doing that, they really elevated the issue in a way, and it was coming from people who people believed and had faith in, literally, and wanted, it gave it a lot more credibility. And so he said if we didn't have the faith community working with the business community, working with the public agencies, we wouldn't be able to do all the things we've done. And so, yeah, you raise a good point, but again, it's not like if more kids are on Boy Scouts, we wouldn't have this opioid problem. I mean, and the thing that I haven't talked about at all is the pharmaceutical industry and how much they pumped into places like West Virginia or Virginia, where it's absurd.
I think that is a big reason why we have an addiction problem.
Well,
much more than how we raise children.
Yeah,
the availability of addictive drugs has destroyed some communities.
Well, these things don't work in a vacuum. All these things are factors, but I think there were a number of cases where I talked to the parents where their kids' first exposure was, my kid played football, he got a knee injury, they gave him like a big tub of Percocet, and he liked it. And then it became kind of a party drug. And then when they started cracking down, then if everyone knows, heroin's cheaper on the street than buying prescription opioids, kids switched to heroin. And it's not like that happened that way with everyone. But then now you have fentanyl in the mix, which is really deadly. It kind of raises the stakes. I think 80% of the fatal overdoses in Fauquier County, which is one of the counties out there, in the last 3 years, fentanyl has been involved. And it's reached the point where in that county, every police officer carries a can of Narcan, not to revive people, but they have that in a separate bag. It's for themselves because they're afraid of exposure to fentanyl if they make an arrest. And there was some story that happened in a police department somewhere in Virginia where a officer was going through a car and he got fentanyl in his tie, and he didn't overdose, but he got really sick. And so now in Fauquier County, Virginia, no sheriff deputy wears a tie because they're fearful of, brushing up against fentanyl. And I mean, people have told me, well, that's crazy. It's not, you can't breathe in fentanyl from a distance and overdose from that, but it's kind of had that effect that we don't want to take any chances. So a long response to your question, your comment.
PTSD is at the bottom of pretty much all of this. And as children, experiencing it by the time you're 4 or 5 years old. And one deliverer of PTSD is divorce is trauma for a child.
Yeah.
And we made divorce socially acceptable.
Okay. Anything else? Any other comments, questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
From my experience working with this population, Sterling Heifers does what it can. And this year, to our program, we added the psychotherapy, which I think is tremendous. It's within the program. We're partnered with the Brattleboro retreat. We have people that are trained and experienced in providing this psychotherapy. But it's a 3-month program.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I understand, people who have addiction, it takes 2 years for the brain synapses to grow back, according to studies.
Mm-hmm.
How can we get more robust programs for this population?
Yeah, I mean, that's ultimately a decision, but the easy answer is get grants. Well, here's what's happening in some ways. The federal government and Congress is like, let's deal with this opioid crisis. Let's throw all this money at these, at the states. And the states say, let's throw it at these municipalities without any kind of plan, and how it's going to be spent and how it's going to be, how that's going to be part of it. I mean, I think you need more programs that maybe there's a foundation in Fauquier County called the PATH Foundation, and they're associated with a hospital out there. They make big grants, and they actually are paying for the construction of a residential facility. You need more commitment like that, because it's really costly. But it needs to be part of the thinking that this is a public health issue for the whole community, and we have to address it as such. And that's a really critical part of it. I think there's obviously no easy answer, but you have to stay on to people like the public health department. They have to assume it as their responsibility to make sure that they're dealing with things like hepatitis C and HIV and the larger issues. The local officials, they have juice in getting grants. They should reach out and see what they can do. It's much easier to say we're not going to deal with it, because it's people don't want the place built here and it's going to cost a lot of money. But that's really the key. You have to have those long-term things. One thing, just relating to your point about the recovery time, this one expert told me, you take the amount of time someone's been a chronic user, and he said if someone's been a chronic user for 5 years, it's going to take them anywhere from 2.5 to 5 years to recover. If they've been a chronic user for 10 years, it's 5 years to 10 years to recover. So, you know, it is a long, long haul to do that. And I think that's the sort of thing that most people just don't think about. Like I said before, people hear the 30-day thing and, you know, easy peasy, which it's just the opposite of that. So, anything else? Yes?
It can be arrested, but never cured.
Pardon me?
Addiction can be arrested, but never cured. It
Yeah.
never goes away. People are not 100% cured when
Right.
they're in recovery.
Right, right,
It's
right.
good to know
Yeah,
that.
that's a good point to make too, that it's not like, you know, you're cleared of addiction. You know, that never really happens. Once your brain becomes addicted, you are an addict and you just have to find your way to work through that. And a lot of people do it successfully, but it's critical on the level of support they get. And that's the thing that I just was not really that aware of, how important all that support is on a daily basis. You know, someone there helping this person along.
Randy, have you spoken to anyone in regards to programs like in Europe, where it's legalized and controlled, and they get psychotherapy with that? And, you know, the drug is not cut with fentanyl.
Right.
all that.
Yeah, I mean, the closest thing to that is medication-assisted treatment here, where you control the level of the medication and you combine it with therapy. It's not quite as sophisticated as it is in Europe, but one of the problems there is that in Virginia, for instance, or in this one county in Fauquier County, the one I mentioned, just a whole lot of doctors, most doctors can write prescriptions for opioids. There are only 3 in the county who are able to write prescriptions for medication-assisted treatment. And someone said to me, look, you have a family practice, do you want to have addicts out in your waiting room? You know? And so there are doctors who are old school, who still have the stigma about addiction, who don't want to take on those patients, even, and don't want to apply for that certification. You know, they see it as, oh, I'm just inviting trouble. I don't need those patients. And one of the guys I talked to who is able to do it, I mean, he can't, people are knocking his door down, you know, to try to get that help, but there's so few of them. And the big part of it is, still in the U.S., there's just so much stigma around this. It's just, you think there's greater awareness, there's no question about that, but on so many levels. Someone told me about women who are pregnant and using who will not get prenatal care because they don't want their doctor to know that they're using. And so that often results in complications from the birth. And again, it's another little ripple effect because people were afraid of that, people becoming aware of that. So, well, I really appreciate you taking the time, and I hope this was helpful. Thanks again. Thanks again.
Thank you.
No,